Okay, we started talking about tefillah, the meaning of davening, last week. And before we try to talk about specific tefillah, specific portions, we introduced the concept last week, and I want to discuss a little bit more broadly the meaning of tefillah. Tefillah, again, means to connect to Hashem. This is the principle of tefillah. To connect to Hashem in tefillah is different than to connect to Hashem through doing a mitzvah. Because a mitzvah also means tzavsa. Tzavsa means connection, chibur. But it's a different type of approach, different type of connection. Essentially, in mitzvah, the connection is due to the fact that we are fulfilling a command from Hashem. And anytime you fulfill a command, you are automatically connected to the one who commanded it. But this connection could be a very external and superficial connection as far as the individual person is concerned. Clearly, it's a very great and significant connection because you're fulfilling a tzivui, a command. But in terms of to what extent you recognize that connection, to what extent you actually experience it, there is even the halacha that mitzvah b'loi kavana, that you can do a mitzvah without a kavana. Mitzvah is einon tzrichas kavanas. That's a halacha. Mitzvah einon tzrichas kavana. You can be yoytze the mitzvah without the kavana. It's explained that there are two levels of kavana in a mitzvah. There is the general kavana, that you're doing this inyan because it's a mitzvah. This kind of kavana is necessary. You have to intend to do the mitzvah, to do what you were commanded, to fulfill a tzivah from the Meivashin. If you're doing it without even intending to do a tzivah, you're just practicing or something, you're not yoytze the mitzvah. But then there is a second, a deeper inyan of kavana, where you have intention, you get involved in the specific mitzvah, and what is the significance of that mitzvah. That is a very great thing, but it's not a prerequisite for doing the mitzvah. Tefillah, the connection in tefillah is principally a personal connection, which means one has to have a personal recognition of what it is that he's doing, because that's what tefillah is. What type of connection can there be? You're saying that through tefillah you connect to Hashem. What does it mean you connect to Hashem? What kind of personal connection is there between a human being and Hashem? The simple inyan in this is that in tefillah we delve a little bit deeper into our own mind, into our own heart, where we recognize that that everything that exists and everything that we come in contact with and everything that we experience in our very self is from Hashem. Now, there are many books, much thought involved in explaining this Indian, how everything is Hashem's creation, how everything is related to Hashem. Nothing happens without Hashem's interference and so forth. Does that mean that in order to daven, one has to be a great scholar and to have learned all of these essays and all of these insights and all of the Maimorim and Chassidus that speak about it before he can get to this? Clearly no. Because any Yid can come and do Avodas Atfilah at any time. Because in fact, there are two very distinct levels in our mind and heart. More importantly, even the heart. Because Tefillah is called Avodah Shebelev, the Avodah in the heart. Although clearly the mind is definitely very profoundly involved and engrossed in the Indian, and yet it's called Avodah Shebelev. Where is that recognition if you haven't learned everything? What is it that you know? What makes you know this principle that allows you to come close and to daven to Hashem? The answer is, as we all know, and we've discussed it many times, that essentially the very simple and pure mind of a Yidden, without knowing how to explain it, without knowing all the philosophy behind it, but because of his soul, just as we discussed many times, there is what's called the human level, like Seichel Anushi. And Seichel Anushi does not need arguments or proofs and justifications for acting as a human being. He's a human being because that's the way he was created. And he has that capacity to recognize inherently and naturally, without any studying, what is right and what is wrong for a human being. Similarly, we have a godly soul. And we have a clear recognition of this simple principle, that everything in fact is godly. When we try to reconcile that with the world that we see, then we have a whole difficulty. For this we need a lot of study. For this we need a lot of explanation. But the very simple recognition of this is inherent, and this is the simple view that a human being, especially a Yid, sees. Which is why, as we explained many times, as soon as he wakes up, he doesn't need any reflection, doesn't need to pick up a Shulchan Aruch or a Chassidus book. He is ready to say Moide Ani, Lefonecho Melech Chai V'Kayim, the living and everlasting King, who has returned my soul to me, because he recognizes instantaneously that this is something which is super world, this whole phenomenon of him waking up with a refreshed soul. He doesn't have to reflect on it. That's how he relates to it. It's not a philosophical expression, it is a personal expression. In this light, I want to explain, as I pointed out last week, I want to explain the principle of what we say in davening, that the whole creation is actually representing Hashem. And the whole creation is constantly singing and praising and saying praise to Hashem. I want to, so there are two questions. First, I want to explain the concept of saying praise, what is meant by saying praise, and singing. Because one would ask, what is our praise? What Hashem needs our praise to be recognized and to be praised. I mean, what does it mean? What's the significance of that? And the song and so forth. And the other is, what does it mean when we say that the creation itself, like we say in davening, Horim v'chol gvois, the mountains and the hills, everything, the sun and the moon and all the stars, everything is in constant state of praise and singing to Hashem. What does that all mean? Did anyone hear the mountains sing? What do we mean by this? But we're saying this. When we're saying this in davening, everything we say in davening, we have to know one rule that is universal in davening. In davening, we do not say anything that we cannot personally relate. That is not real to us. That's what davening is. That's what davening is. Just to say the words is not davening. Davening means tefillah, to connect. So, granted that it takes effort on our part to clear our minds and to find the pure view that we have in our minds to recognize this. For this we need that's called avodah. You have to clear everything, all extraneous thoughts and all interfering thoughts, and get down to the very depths on the crevices of our mind. That's a whole big avodah. But it's there. And we have to understand, what do we mean by this? What does it mean the mountains sing and give praise? First, I want to discuss the whole concept of song, singing and praising Hashem. We have mentioned, I believe, last week or other times, that there are certain stages that a person's experience goes through. First, he understands certain phenomenon. He gets more involved. And the more he gets involved, the more he recognizes the significance of it, the more he experiences it, the closer he gets to it, the less he is able to contain himself and speak in a contained and an organized fashion, until he gets to a point where the only way to react is that he sings. Just as in our experience, when you talk about simcha, when do we get to singing and dancing? We recognize a certain great, significant occurrence, and we discuss it, and we reflect on it. The more we reflect on it, the more we're influenced, the more we get involved in the significance of that occurrence, and its great influence and its great revelation and great significance. until such time that we can no longer just express it in words and contained in a logical fashion. And the only way we can really express what we think and what we feel is in song. What is the song? What is the aspect of song? Song means that the experience that you are currently going through is not a limited experience, not an experience that can be contained, meaning there is the experience and there is you. You can separate yourself from it. You can analyze it. You can speak about it in some kind of a rational and logical fashion. When it encompasses you, when it becomes all-encompassing, when it becomes all true, then you recognize its richness and its beauty at the level that it actually permeates your whole person. And the only way for you to express that experience is in song. To illustrate this on a very on the lowest level that we can possibly illustrate this is that when one observes a very beautiful palace, a royal palace, when he speaks about, when he observes it, it's the architecture, the design, and all the greatness of a palace is not only in the design and its beauty. The greatness of a palace is also in the abundance. In other words, it's being built, and the building itself represents that there are no restrictions, there are no limits as to what's going to be, what kind of houses is going to be. Everything is there. It expands to the point of where it absolutely no longer needs to be expanded. This is the idea of a palace, of a royal palace. It represents abundance, it represents limitless resource. But as long as you're outside of it, you can still contain it, you can speak about it. And yes, you become affected, you become what's called wowed, and you spoil. Nevertheless, you can still contain that hispoilus. If you are invited inside, and there you're actually part of it, where you can no longer just observe it as on the outside and observe the total view. But wherever you look, you see the richness. You're part of it. Then the expression, your reaction, is no longer rational. The reaction is an experience. By being in this palace, you feel elated, elevated. There's an experience of being somewhat higher than your normal limits. If we can project the idea in our experience. The similar Inyan is translated in song. When do we sing? We sing when our experience is such that is so overwhelming and is so elevating that we can no longer speak about it. We can no longer put it in perspective. it imbues, it contains us completely. And once it contains us completely, the only way we can express our experience is through song. And then occasionally in dance. So singing to Hashem, what does it mean to sing to Hashem? Singing to Hashem means that once one recognizes the presence of Hashem and Hashem's hashgacha and Hashem bracha to the extent that that Hashem's presence in his life or in the world is not limited to one action or to another, but it is all encompassing. And wherever he looks, whatever he observes, he sees a superior quality in it. Because even though he's looking at the world, but he recognizes this is a world created by God. This is not just a physical world. So it's like being inside the palace. When Yidden, the first song in the Torah is right after Kriyas Yamsuf. After the splitting of the Red Sea, when Yidden crossed over safely and the Egyptians were drowned, there were multiple miracles. It wasn't just what's called an act of miracle. The entire episode expressed one very simple message, that there are no limits. World does not represent any kind of a limit. World is the presence of God, nothing else. There is no such thing as nature. The nature of water is this, the nature of water is that. Nothing. There's no nature. There are no limits that have to be conformed to. It is a presence, a godly presence. And the godly presence is so close to us, has come so close to us in terms of paying attention to our needs, paying attention to our welfare, paying attention to our future, paying attention of making us into a nation, that we were completely overwhelmed. It wasn't just saying a thank you. It was way beyond that. It can only be expressed in song and in poetry. This is the concept of song. When one gets completely overwhelmed, not overwhelmed to the point where he loses himself, overwhelmed to the point where rationally he cannot contain himself, he expresses, he feels it on a much deeper and greater level. This, in fact, is why Tefillah is called Aveda Shebelev, Aveda with the heart, in the heart. Even though clearly we recognize the truth in our brain, our mind recognizes the truth, not the heart. But here, when we recognize the truth at the level where we can no longer contain it at a rational level, then it is the heart that responds. The heart responds dynamically, without limit. Therefore, clearly, since that tefillah means that we connect to Hashem, and tefillah means that we connect to Hashem in a pnimizdik, in a personal level. That means that in tefillah we come to a point where we actually recognize, not only recognize, but experience. We recognize the level of experience of the presence of Hashem in the world. We see the world in an entirely different light. Just like the Yidden at Kriyas Yamsuf saw the world in a different light. They saw that the world is all godly, it doesn't represent any kind of worldly limit, worldly rules. In Tefillah, too, we see the world from the light, from a godly perspective. This, in essence, means coming close to Hashem, which means coming close to the godliness that we recognize in the world. To go beyond the worldly structure, the natural structure that conceals godliness and appears to be just working in a certain logical and natural fashion. We see that actually everything that there is actually a godly presence. It says, just to illustrate this point, that the first thing we do in the morning is actually is davening. After that, let's say if someone is a businessman or he has to go to work or whatever, his occupation in normal worldly structure, he has to go out and earn a livelihood. And the livelihood he earns because he works. He has a job or he has a business that he has to worry and know what he says and how he deals with it. Before he goes to the business, he davens. What does this mean? He davens before he goes to business. So normally we say that it means that he asks Hashem to give him hatzlocha in his business. But it goes much deeper than that. Tefillah is what prepares a person for the day, so that when he goes into his normal, natural world day, he doesn't get lost in the nature, but it keeps him afloat. It keeps him in perspective. He doesn't get lost in his worldly affairs. Because in Tefillah, he comes to recognize the real truth. Yes, there is a whole world, and it has a natural format, a logical format, but all of this functions because there's a godly soul in it, not because of its natural cause and effects. So that if I have to go out and earn a livelihood, and the livelihood is going to be earned through a certain activity and certain processes, Tefillah gives me the perspective that all of these processes is just a means to receive it into the world. But really, what I'm getting is, I'm getting it directly from Hashem. I'm getting it directly from God. It's not a natural phenomenon. There's a natural means by which I receive it, but not a natural means by which it's created. It's made to be. And this sense we get by tefillah. In davening. Because in davening we see the whole world completely in a different light. We see the world, we don't fly away from the world. Particularly in the first section of davening, as we are going to discuss in Mitzvah Hashem. But we see through, we see above the natural limits.
I have a question, but you started with a question about how we don't see mountains dancing.
I didn't finish that. Okay. So, this is the objective, this is the union of tefillah. When we see the world from this light, as we said, then we see a totally different world. To introduce that concept, what world do we see? I want to go back to what we discussed. I think mentioned it many times. The curse of the serpent. after the Chet Hadas, the serpent was responsible for the whole sin. And he was the first one to be cursed. And what did the curse of the serpent consist in? The first thing was that that you will crawl on your belly rather than walk on legs, as it was before. The serpent had legs. He fell down to his belly, lost his legs, and this is for all times. Fell down to his belly, and then and you will eat dust throughout your lifetime. So, in analyzing this, as we have done in the past, what kind of curse is this from a worldly perspective? When one is worried about satisfying his needs, that's all. Satisfying the needs, the serpent doesn't have to worry about it at all. He's got his food available wherever he goes. He doesn't even have to worry about suspending himself. Every animal standing on legs, he has to make sure that he has a place to put his legs down and that he's not going to stumble and fall and get hurt. There's a certain effort involved in security. And as we discussed, I think the other day, the most vulnerable of all of these, of course, is the human being. Because the human being stands on two legs, which is totally not geared for from a physical perspective, for security. Because the human being is totally held up by his mind, by his soul. His legs are not giving him the balance. It's his brain that's giving him the balance, that's holding him up. But every other animal has a natural form that gives him a balance. He stands on four, or he is supported with a balance of the body and so forth. The serpent is the only one that has absolutely no concern about balancing. No possibility of him falling down. So he is the most secure of all creatures. What kind of curse is that? What in fact is this curse? And I want to give you the whole perspective as much as we can go into now. The serpent approached Chava, as you know, and he convinced her that to eat from the Eitz Hadas is a good idea. Rashi on the spot says that God, the Creator, is very smart. He doesn't want you to eat from the Eitz Hadas. Because if you eat from Eitz Hadas, you will be like him. And then he goes a step further, which is not mentioned in the Chumash, but Rashi brings it down from the Medrash. That he said to Chava, he said that God himself ate from the Eitz Hadas, and that's how he was able to create the world. Min ha'etz ochel bara ha'olam. He ate from this eitz, and he got the smarts, the wisdom of how to make things work, and that's how he will create the world. And therefore he said to Chava, your best bet is to eat from Eitz Hadas, and you become independent of God. You can also be creating worlds. Clearly there's a world that can be, discussed on this and spoken on this. But just even if we see this in a very narrow and limited fashion, So he convinced Chava the union of Eitz Hadas that he caused her to sin was not merely that he caused her to sin. There was a concerted effort to break away from God. You don't need God. Eitz Hadas, and then you're independent. So in his curse, his intent was satisfied. His curse is such that puts him in that position that he, in fact, has no sense of his connection to God. He lives in the physical world. He crawls on the ground. He never lacks, he doesn't have a life sense that he should want something beyond his very physical presence. It's all there. There isn't a thought that my food has to come from someplace. And that I balance myself on my legs so that I have a certain sense of balance, a certain sense of general orientation. That's what balance is. Balance is, relative to this place and to that place. Nothing. It is not relative to anything. He is just who he is, finished. Just like a rock is not concerned about balancing, so too the serpent is not concerned about balancing. He's totally severed. His relationship to God in terms of his awareness and experience is totally severed. He lives entirely within the context of the world. With me? In contrast to every other animal in the world and everything else that is in the world. Clearly, an animal does not have human intelligence and does not know to identify where he's looking forward to get his needs from. He doesn't have that intelligence at all. But one thing the animal does have. He does have the sense that there is a presence, there is a world beyond me, beyond my own existence. And this is where my needs are coming from. The lion roars and he goes out to look for his prey. What is he roaring into? Into open space. By open space, where's the food going to come from? From someplace. Every animal has a sense that there is something beyond the limits of his own existence. So true, the animal doesn't recognize what is going on, no question about it. But in fact, this recognition, this life that exists there, that he roars when he gets his prey, which means, oh, something really happened, I got it. Or the birds chirp, or every animal has its own way of expressing its excitement or its need. That itself is, as I said, is an expression of relating to some greater reality than himself. And during davening, we recognize where that recognition comes from, what it really represents. That in fact, it is recognizing that there is in fact a greater presence. And this greater presence is always present for me. And somehow, if I go out, I'll find my prey, I'll find my food. It's going to come my way somehow. And when I find it, I'm going to be excited and I'm going to scream out of joy. I'm going to take it for granted because it just came from someplace. This, in effect, is a song to the Creator of the world. The only one who does not possess song in his nature is a serpent. The serpent only has anger and venom. Every other animal has one way or another to express a song. Because he has the sense of this growth, of this coming from someplace. The same is true not only of animals, but everything in the world. Everything in the world. Like we said, mentioned last time, briefly, the sun, as we see it in davening, the sun comes forth to do its service, to do its duty, to give light to the world. It is an expression of, and I said, the sun is saying Shira. There is something beyond my own existence. It's saying Shira to me.
How does the sun do Shira?
Huh?
How does it do Shira?
It's movement. Its movement is a Shira. The mountains also have a growth pattern, and the mountains produce, when the mountains themselves grow, and there is a production of vegetation and trees and all that. This is all an expression of Shira. It's all an expression of more of, like I said, of not just my existence. Recognition, oh, there is something more. In truth, the very inanimate object, the stone itself, as the Arizal explains, and the Tanya brings it down, and Shayichud V'Emunah explains there briefly that even the inanimate object also has a soul, except it's called a nefesh hadoimemes, which means it's a nefesh, and he expresses his excitement, quote unquote, by being quiet, by saying nothing. For this, to discuss this definitively and conclusively, we'll have to have a whole, a very concentrated and deep discussion. But in general, this gives us an inkling, gives us a sense. What does it mean that we enter davening? How do we view the world in davening, from a davening perspective? And what does davening ultimately, what happens as a result of davening? This is what it says in Hasidus, that davening is not just for the moment. It's the beginning of the day. To whatever degree a person reaches into the purity of davening, and then afterwards, of course, he has to distract himself from this and go into other duties. A roishem, it's called a rishima, a roishem, an impression is left of the davening. The impression is that there was a moment today when I recognized that there is something greater than the world. That the world itself has a chayas, has a life force in it. And that's the real principle of the world. Having said and explained all of this, we can now reflect and begin to understand the importance of davening and why Chassidus put such a great emphasis on davening. And it is that davening is the means, it's the moment in a person's life, and it's the means to touch the essence of his soul. The essence of his soul, we don't mean very deeply, but just to live for the moment as a human being, meaning living with his soul rather than with his body, viewing the world and his life and his existence in this world from a soul perspective, from perspective of truth, of value, of meaning, rather than how the body can interpret things, how the body relates to things. The body is called in Kabbalah, in Zohar, and Hasidus brings it down, the body is called Moshcha Dechivio. Moshcha Dechivio means the hide of the serpent. The body is that part in the person that can only relate, and in and of itself can only relate to the physical, natural world. On its own, even though we have power of logic and we can understand things and we can argue things, it does not bring down any light, does not bring down any soul, any life into it. Even if we were great philosophers and we learned through philosophy, and we succeeded logically in our brain to prove the presence of God in the world, it would not do for us that which davening does. Because this would only tell us logically what the truth is. It doesn't connect us to the truth. It does not give us the inspiration, the elevation, the real experience of it. This will be like looking at the palace from outside and never stepping inside. Davening is the real moment when a person is, it could be said, a real human being. He really experiences that which a human being is supposed to experience, or he has an opportunity to experience. He can view the world from a real, live, neshama perspective. So I hope in Mitzvah Hashem, as we go on, we'll be able to examine certain portions of davening and go into more detail how each portion of the davening fits into this principle and what it brings out. And what are the various stages in davening? Because we know there are stages. There is the beginning of davening, Psuki de Zimra, then there's Birchas Krishma, and then there's Shemoneh Esrei, the ultimate level. So we're able, Mitzvah Hashem, to examine the various tefillas and the various portions. But it's important to understand from what perspective we are examining them. We're examining the tefillahs come to us from a perspective of tefillah, of we are connecting to Hashem. Not that we stand out and say, okay, what do I figure this out? What do I understand about it? The first step in davening is to come close and to clear one's mind from everything that distracts, everything that disturbs, everything that that is related to serpentism, everything that is related to lifelessness. And then be able to understand, to see the insights that the tefillah brings out. That is contained in the davening. Davening, just in conclusion, I want to mention a very interesting quote from the Tanya, where the Tanya says, this is later on in the Igros, he says that for good deeds, for tzedakah and so forth, a person will be rewarded with that his heart and mind will open in davening. And there he asks a very curious question. He says, where is the correspondence? We can understand that he will get rewarded, he will get Gan Eden, he will get all kinds of different rewards. But that his mind and heart should open in davening, that's such a great thing. Where does that come in? How is that related to good deeds? In other words, that which a person can gain in davening is greater than even what Gan Eden can give. And he asks the question, where is the justification? How does he get such a reward? I understand Gan Eden. How can he get such a reward? That his mind should open up in davening. That's incongruent. Doesn't fit. It's beyond his deserve. So I'm hoping that this brief introduction and the insight that we discussed will hopefully give you a little bit more encouragement and more feeling a closer relationship to davening, to whatever extent. It's avoida. It's hard work. To clear one's mind, to clear one's heart, this doesn't come easy. But we understand what's behind it. What happens when we clear our minds and hearts? This becomes the light for our day and the light for our lives. It's a totally different life, totally different day and totally different life. Hatzlacha.
I,